Hello guys, and welcome to my video about the Poison Speedfarming build that I'm using for about 1 week now. This build is mainly focused at clearing nightmare dungeons at around level 65 until level 75. It has a decent mix of offensive and defensive capabilities, but at around 75 to 80 is where the defenses are just not strong enough anymore to sustain you throughout the entire dungeon. And this is why the sweet spot for speedfarming with this build is at around tier 70. At first, I will give you a short overview about the skills. We're using Poison Trap, Shadow Step, Dash, Poison Imbuement, Puncture, and Twisting Blades. As this is a Twisting Blade speedfarming build, we are also using combo points. This build is obviously aimed at level 100 characters. If you are lower level than that, you probably have to make some individual adjustments, but in general, leveling is quite fast with the new Nightmare Dungeon experience at the moment, so you'll probably get there really quick. The helm, we are using the Mites aspect to give us increased damage reduction while we're using Puncture. As we're playing combo, we'll be using Puncture quite a lot, so this will be active all the time. We want ranks to Poison Improvement, cooldown reduction, maximum life, and total armor. For the chest, we're using the Cheats aspect to give us increased damage reduction against crowd-controlled enemies. We have a lot of crowd control in this build, so this is going to be active a lot of times. And for the stats, we want total armor, flat damage reduction, just like we're going to be using it on the pants, and damage reduction from close enemies and damage reduction from enemies that are distant. I have poison reduction on this one because I did not get a chest with distant reduction, but if you have double poison reduction, that's also fine. Ideally, you would want poison reduction on one piece and distant on the other. With the pants, I am using these. I have total armor, flat damage reduction from close enemies, and enemies that are poisoned. For the aspect, we're using Disobedience. For the gems, I have maximum life slotted with a mixture of damage reduction by control impaired. You can use either. Damage reduction by control impaired helps you if your Shadow Step is on cooldown to not accidentally die, and max life helps you in general to tank infrequent hits a lot better. For the gloves, we're using standard offensive gloves for any Twisting Blades build with ranks to Twisting Blades, critical strike chance, lucky hit chance, and attack speed. We're also using the aspect of Shared Misery in order to spread all of our crowd control effects to other unaffected enemies that are nearby. For the boots, we're using the unique boots Penitent Greaves. If you do not have Penitent Greaves, you can use any other legendary boots with the Ravager aspect that gives you another charge of Shadow Step. For stats, you would want something like movement speed, energy cost reduction, damage reduction while injured, and all stats. But for this build, in particular, we want to use Penitent Greaves because the legendary aspect gives us more crowd control and also increases our damage dealt to chilled enemies. We're using that in combination with the passive Frigid Finesse, which I'll be explaining later on the line as well. For our neck, we're using the legendary aspect Corruption, which increases our imbuement potency against vulnerable enemies. A big source of our damage is coming from bursting venoms. So whenever we're standing in the poison pool, we get additional charges of poison imbuement, and it has no cooldown and no charge limit. So ideally, we would want to use that as often as we can, and Corruption helps us deal more damage while it's active. For the stats on the amulet, we're using energy cost reduction, movement speed, and cooldown reduction. And I personally have opted to use the exploit passive because we most of the time want to kill mobs as fast as we can, and exploit helps us doing that. Just because it increases the damage dealt to healthy enemies, which in turn brings the mobs, if we attack them the first time, to a lower health threshold, where ideally the second part of exploit is kicking in, where we deal increased damage to injured enemies as well. So it helps with our upfront damage, and that helps clear any strangling mobs at the back. For the ring, we're using the Bursting Venoms, as I've mentioned before, on a lucky hit that is performed with the critical strike of poison imbued skills. So what does that mean? We want critical strike chance as high as we can, and we want lucky hit chance to be as high as we can so that we can proc this as often as possible. Also, attack speed helps with that. We have a chance on a lucky hit crit within a poison imbued skill of 10% to create a toxic pool that deals poison damage. The poison damage here is not really relevant, but it's more the effect. For 3 seconds, there will be a pool on the ground that lets you recast poison imbuement as often as you want, as long as it's active. And that is a really, really high damage output because you can do a lot of attacks in this 3-second window, which is why attack speed is also really good. And for the stats on the ring, we want vulnerable damage, critical strike damage, critical strike chance, and resource generation. We want as much resource generation as we can because we are not playing with inner sight. For the second ring, we want the same stats: vulnerable, crit damage, crit chance, and resource generation, but on this ring we're using the Umbral aspect. Umbral gives us 4 of our primary resource whenever we crowd control an enemy. This also procs when we crowd control an enemy through shared misery. So all of the crowd control we apply is even better because we get more energy back from this aspect. For our weapons, we're going to use a Blade Dancer's crossbow. We're going to use the Blade Dancing aspect to increase our Twisting Blades damage. It is important to have it on the crossbow because we do not always have an imbuement active, even with Bursting Venoms, so that our Twisting Blades are still able to clear out any mobs in 70s or 75s without much hassle. For stats, we want vulnerable damage, critical strike damage, dexterity, and all stats. Usually, you would want close damage, damage to close enemies, on your crossbow, but in this case we're using all stats to hit certain Paragon breakpoints, which I will explain later. These Paragon breakpoints and the all stats itself give us more value than another roll of additional damage to close enemies would bring us. For the sword, we're using a accelerating sword. The accelerating aspect helps us increase our attack speed, which in turn gives us more procs of all of our good effects, and it also helps with spreading crowd control faster and all that stuff. For stats, we want vulnerable damage, we want critical strike damage, damage to close enemies, and dexterity. In this case, we do not need additional all stats because we have enough all stats on our crossbow. For the second weapon, you can either use Ashiara's Kanja, this legendary dagger, which gives a more increased attack speed the more often you attack, and lucky hit chance. This is very, very beneficial to the general idea of our build, that we want to have as many lucky hits as possible and as many attacks as possible in the 3-second window where Bursting Venoms is active. If you do not have a Shirara's Kanja, you can also use a sword with similar stats to this one, but you would use Edgemaster's aspect on that. Alternatively, you can also use Condemnation. If you have a really well-rolled Condemnation, then you can use that as well. Normally, you would be wanting to attack 1 time with Puncture, and then 1 time with Twisting Blades, like an alternating pattern. Left click, right click, for example. With Condemnation, that stays the same, basically. But when you have Poison Imbuement active, it makes more sense to pay attention to get all of the 3 combo points before attacking. First, we're using Puncture, with the upgrades that give us energy when we hit a crowd control enemy. This is very nice because all enemies we attack are most of the time crowd controlled, especially so because Puncture, the base skill, also slows enemies on the 3rd cast or if we critical strike them. And then we obviously using if all 3 blades hit, if at least 2 blades hit an enemy, they become vulnerable. Puncture is our bread and butter skill. We use it in between every cast of Twisting Blades to keep the crowd control up, to gain energy, and to apply vulnerable to the enemies that need it. Then we're using Twisting Blades. Obviously we max that skill, and we want to take the upgrades, enhanced Twisting Blades and improved Twisting Blades to have further crowd control through days, which we also can spread with Shared Misery again. Shadow Step, this is our tool to escape any crowd control that is applied onto us, or to actually stun enemies, which we can then also spread with Shared Misery. You ideally want to engage with Shadow Step if you know there's no crowd control coming your way. If you're a bit unsure, just engage with dash instead. Dash is also used to increase our damage dealt with critical strikes the enemies. You could technically also use the Disciplined Dash upgrade, but we already have Dazed and Slowed, so we do not need to apply it another time with Dash. Then we use Poison Trap with the Knockdown upgrade and the Subverting Poison Trap to deal more poisoning damage while we're standing in Poison Trap. This is very beneficial because if we stand in Poison Trap while we get the Bursting Venoms proc, we will just deal 10% more multiplicative damage. We then have Poison Imbuement. We want to max Poison Imbuement as high as we can. You can potentially also have all imbuements on your amulet to push this even further, but I personally have not seen the need for that, and I think Exploit helps us more overall. Because Poison Imbuement, even with Bursting Venoms, is not always active. We take the upgrade of Enhanced Poison Imbuement, and then the Blended Poison Imbuement upgrade, and we take the Momentum Key passive. There is a case to take Close Quarters Combat, which gives us even more attack speed and more damage against crowd control enemies, but especially if you're pushing into the 70s, you will really like the additional 20% damage reduction that Momentum gives you. Also, the energy regeneration is really, really nice and very beneficial to this build, and the movement speed also helps with repositioning or getting from pack to pack faster. For the passives, we use 1 rank of Sturdy, 1 rank of Siphoning Strikes. This just helps us staying alive longer. If you have trouble staying alive, you can put more points into Siphoning Strikes or Sturdy, and just take some points away from Weapon Mastery, Exploit, or Malice. We use all 3 of them. Weapon Mastery gives us flat damage increase with swords, and also increased damage to healthy enemies if we play a dagger. Then we have Exploit, which allows us to burst mobs even faster, and finish them off quicker. And then we have Malice, which increases any damage we deal to vulnerable enemies by 9%. We also take the Concussive passive, which after knocking back or knocking down an enemy, we get increased critical strike chance against them. This is really nice because Poison Trap knocks them down, so we get increased critical strike chance against them. And again, critical strike chance helps us proc more Bursting Venoms because we have to do a lucky hit with the critical strike, and then it's a chance to proc the Bursting Venoms pool. We also take trick attacks because if we critical strike a dazed enemy, they are knocked down for 0.5 seconds. And this is basically a circle. You get increased critical strike chance against knockdown enemies, and you knock them down with this passive. So they are dazed a lot of the times because we actually have the improved Twisting Blades upgrade from dazed. We take the Precision Imbuement, that our imbuement skills gain critical strike chance. We actually want to have that as high as possible because we want to critically strike with imbuement skills to get more Bursting Venom procs. Then we take 1 point in Deadly Venom, 1 point in Debilitating Toxins, and 1 point in Alchemical Advantage to increase our attack speed. You could technically put more points into Debilitating Toxins if you feel like you're getting too much damage in a Nightmare Dungeon, because this actually reduces the damage the enemies deal to you and does not increase your defenses, which means the incoming damages you receive and is then reduced by your defenses is 5, 10, or 15% lower. Then we have Frigid Finesse, which we use because we use the Chill Boots. We deal 15% increased damage to chilled enemies, and if they become frozen, we even deal 30% increased damage to them. If you play the Penitent Greaves, then you will always want to pick up Frigid Finesse. And in the last part of the ultimate skills, we have Innovation, that lucky hits give us 30% chance to gain 8 energy. This is really nice because the 8 energy gained is also increased by any resource generation that we have, and if we have both on the rings and a bit of energy generation from strength, we gain around 12 to 13 energy per proc of Innovation. This is really nice because we also have lucky hit chance on our Ashiara's Conjure and on the gloves. So this procs really often. Then we have Trap Mastery. When Poison Trap or Death Trap activates, you gain 12% increased critical strike chance against vulnerable and crowd controlled enemies. This does not mean the enemies have to be affected by the trap for you to gain this benefit. They just have to be either vulnerable or crowd controlled. So this is basically a free 12% increased critical strike chance. To get our energy regeneration up while we're moving. And lastly, we use Haste so that when we are above 50% maximum energy, which is what we usually are when we are moving between packs, we get an increased movement speed. And if we are below 50% maximum energy, which does happen quite a lot when we're fighting and using our energy to cast Twisting Blades. We gain increased attack speed, which then in turn helps us to be faster with our puncture casts in between our Twisting Blade casts. We use the combo specialization as I've described before. If you do not have that much resource generation on your rings, and you generally feel like you're starved for energy a lot of the times, then you can also use Inner Sight, but keep in mind that combo points is just more damage overall. It makes no sense to use Preparation for us, because we do not use an ultimate skill. As for Paragons, we have a 7-board Paragon setup, which is rather unusual, but we want to use all of the glyphs that are beneficial to us to as much potential as we can. On the starting board, we socket Control for more damage against crowd-controlled targets. As we remember, Puncture also slows our enemies, so this is pretty much active all the time. And we also gain stun through Shadow Step. The next board we pick is Tricks of the Trade. This gives us increased damage when we use a marksman skill for our next cutthroat skill, as we are always alternating puncture and Twisting Blades. We basically gain this benefit on every single cast, and this is basically just 25% multiplicative increase to our damage, which is really, really nice. On this board we socket the Closer glyph, which gives us increased damage to our cutthroat skills, that's Twisting Blades for example, and we get damage reduction while wielding a melee weapon. So when we're using any melee skill or melee weapon, we get 10% reduced damage, which is really nice. We also pick up critical strike damage here. We go into the rare nodes for more elite damage, and we go into the Lawless node for more armor. At the bottom, we grab Brawler for damage to close enemies and damage reduction from close enemies, which helps us survive more. And then we exit the board to the right and go into the next board with this, which is Cheap Shot. As we are crowd controlling enemies nearly all of the time, Cheap Shot benefits us really, really much, because we get a 5% increase per enemy that is crowd controlled. So if we're standing in 5 mobs, we already get the maximum benefit of 25%. This is really nice with Shared Misery, because that way we can spread our crowd control and make sure that there's enough enemies that are crowd controlled next to us, which gives us a really nice damage increase. We start to grab this node at the top, or press, which gives us damage to crowd controlled enemies and critical strike damage to crowd controlled enemies. And as we have discussed before, enemies are crowd controlled most of the time if we fight them, so this is basically a free damage increase. At the glyph, we're taking Devious for even more damage to crowd controlled enemies, and we're taking Wilds to get damage reduction from slowed enemies. As we have said, Puncture does slow our enemies, so we get a free 27% damage reduction from any enemy that is slowed. For the glyph here, we take Efficacy. This helps us increase our imbuement potency even further, which helps us with dealing more damage, more poisoning over time. And Efficacy also gives us a bonus to all rare nodes in range. So that's Devious and Wilds. And what Efficacy does in that case is it gives us 15% increased damage reduction from slowed enemies and 37.5 damage reduction to crowd controlled enemies, and an additional 25 dex, which is really, really beneficial to have. And go into our next board, which is Deadly Ambush. We use Deadly Ambush because we use Poison Trap, and dealing increased critical strike damage, 23% multiplicative to enemies affected by our trap skills, is really nice. And also here, the enemies do not have to be standing in the Poison Trap for that to be active, they just have to be poisoned by the Poison Trap at some point. We come from the bottom, we go into Spring Loaded to get a reduction in the arm time of our traps. We want Poison Trap to be armed really fast, so it instantly snaps when we go into the fight, in which we add Diminish, which also gives us a bonus to all rare nodes in range. And this bonus gives us more damage to enemies that are affected by our trap skills, but also, most importantly, more damage reduction from enemies affected by our trap skills, which is the Cunning node and the Engineering node. Then we grab the Legendary node, go down here, grab Slayer for more armor. We exclusively grab this for the armor. The potion healing is not that beneficial to us, but 200 armor is really nice, especially when we have a lot of plus armor percent rolls on our gear that improves our armor even further. And then we exit this board to the left as well. Then we go into the fifth board, which is Exploit Weakness. We do not take the legendary node here because we do not need the additional damage from it, and the path to the node is really, really long. We take Artifice here to have an increase of vulnerable damage. And as you can see here, we already are slightly above our strength breakpoint, which is why we're using all stats on the crossbow. If you do not have all stats on the crossbow, you would not get the additional 10% vulnerable damage here. So keep that in mind. For the glyph, we're using Exploit here. We are not maxing out the Exploit glyph because it only gives us 4% per point. We're more interested in getting the additional bonus effect of the glyph, which is damaging an enemy for the first time makes them vulnerable for 3 seconds. That's really nice because anything we hit is instantly vulnerable for the first time, is instantly vulnerable for 3 seconds. And this cannot happen more than once every 20 seconds per enemy. So any new enemy you hit can still benefit from this or be affected by this, but per enemy it's only once. We do not take this node because we do not need the potion healing or the additional dexterity. Then we branch out to the left, grab Exploit here for another 20% increase in vulnerable damage, and 25% more damage to injured enemies, which is also nice to have. This again requires a 530 intelligence breakpoint, which you only get if you have a crossbow that has at least 79 alt stats when you have it upgraded. I personally have one with 81 alt stats, so I'm 2 points above the threshold here. Exit this board at the top and go into our 6th board, which is Cunning Stratagem. We're basically picking this board only for the bonuses it gives us and the glyph socket. We slot in Turf here because it's really easy to pick up the strength nodes along the way, and we get a lot of armor from it as well. We use Finisher to gain an increase in core skill damage and dexterity. And then we're using Lawless to get even more armor and also more dexterity. And use this path to gain another 100 armor, which really helps us staying alive a lot longer. Turf gains us 10% damage reduction against close enemies, which is very, very valuable as we are nearly always close to the enemy. And it also increases our damage we deal to close enemies, so we definitely want to pick that up. For our last board, we go into No Witnesses. We also do not take the legendary node here because we do not use an ultimate skill, so we don't need that. And we go into the glyph socket and socket combat in that one, which requires intelligence and gives us more critical strike damage with our core skills, which is really nice because we have a lot of critical strike chance in this build and we can really, really use the additional critical strike damage. Also, the additional bonus of the glyph gives us energy cost. Gives us a refund of 12% of the energy cost of any skill that we use that critically strikes. In that case, that would be Twisting Blades because that's the only thing that costs energy. And any critical strike we deal gives us 12% back of the energy cost, which is really nice. We stock a glyph into this board because this node up here gives us increase to damage and also gives intelligence. So it makes it really easy to get the full bonus of the glyph with just picking up a few nodes in between. On this clip, you can see me attempt a Nightmare Dungeon tier 69. It's a Bandit Mineworks, which is kind of okay in the first part, where it's only spiders and not that difficult enemies to deal. You can see that I usually engage with Dash or Shadow Step to spread all of the crowd control as fast as I can. And then once I get the Bursting Venoms proc, I just attack as fast as I can, basically, to get the most value out of it. I'm still slaying the mobs that give damage reduction, so I do not have to deal with them later when I'm actually fighting elites. So as you can see here, I am basically trying to take out these elites as fast as possible, while still trying to dodge the attacks from the the Lightning Storm Follower, and trying to interact with all the prisoners and freeing them. So if there's still any pressing questions. So when I'm engaged with the mobs, I try to use Poison Trap when I do not have Poison Imbuement ready, to make sure they are still poisoned even though I can't attack with Poison Imbuement. So for speed farming, you usually want to take a tier that is clearable for you in like 5 to 6 minutes, maybe even 7 minutes if it's one of the longer ones. but your main focus for speed farming should be getting loot. And that means you want to kill as many elites and loot as many chests as possible in as short of a time frame as possible. So that also means that you try to not get stuck too long on trash mobs like I'm doing here right now. And ideally you would want to pick a dungeon that has easy objectives where you do not have to stand still a lot. For that you can refer to the Nightmare Dungeon tier list that Maxroll has brought out, which is great for glyph leveling and also solo experience if you're not level 100 yet. In these intermission events, you do not gain any experience, and the monsters do not drop any loot. So I'm just trying to complete this as fast as possible while not dying, so that I can move on to the next stage. In the second part of Embedded Mine Works, it becomes a bit harder, because the archers and banshees do deal quite a bit of damage, especially on 69, because the build is a bit tight on defenses. We're trying to squeeze in as much offense as we can without sacrificing too much defense. We basically just want to have enough defense to survive anything that comes our way comfortably without having to struggle too much. That being said, this build is also not suited to push very much higher than 75 or 80 maybe, because it's just not designed to have the defenses required for that tier. If you do want to push higher though, you can check out my other builds, especially the Nightmare Dungeon 100 build that I have on Maxroll as well. This build also assumes that you are level 100 to have all the nodes and all the Paragon points required. And it really does benefit from having the glyphs at least level 15, so you get all the additional bonuses from them, which is why we chose them, because they are bonuses. You only unlock the second part of the bonus when they're level 15. Alright, if you like this build and want to see more about the builds I do, then stay tuned for more videos. And if you happen to test this build, I hope you have a lot of fun with it, and I personally really enjoyed playing it, and I'll see you guys in the next video.